Hey, this is Patrick James Lynch, co-host of the BloodStream Podcast. And before we dive into the episode, I wanted to share a couple things with you. I'm recording this cold open on Friday, June 15th, a little bit later than the episode itself. And at the time of the recording, Natalie and I didn't know who our interview guest was going to be. We knew we wanted it to be somebody to speak about the WFH's World Congress and ideally about the representation of women with bleeding disorders at the conference. I was hopeful to be able to get Lisa Thibeault. She is the registered nurse coordinator at the Southeastern Ontario Regional Inherited Bleeding Disorders Program in Ontario, Canada, working under one of the leading hematologists for women with bleeding disorders, Dr. Paula James. I met Lisa at the World Congress, talked to her about coming on the podcast, and we were able to figure it out amongst our schedules, which was tough. Only just the last couple days, so you don't hear me mention her name in the formal introduction to the episode. So I wanted to give her shout out now and let you know that she's an expert and working for an expert hematologist on women with bleeding disorders. So great guest, some really good insights in that interview. Also, the Teen Impact Awards. Believe Limited has been facilitating the Teen Impact Awards now. This is our fourth year. It takes place during National Hemophilia Foundation's Bleeding Disorders Conference on the opening night after opening session in the exhibition hall. And it recognizes teens affected by bleeding disorders, so that's patients, siblings, and children, teens affected by bleeding disorders who are making a positive impact in their home, school, or community, and have done so at some point in the last year. If you know a teen who in the last year has done something remarkable for our community, give them a chance to get recognized at the Teen Impact Awards. We have opened the website, teenimpactawards.com. You'll find all the information there and an FAQ with the most commonly asked questions. Take a look at that and nominate an inspiring teen that you know. Also want to mention that Stop the Bleeding, comedic web series, award-winning comedic web series about bleeding disorders. Our eighth season continues to roll out as the summer goes on. June 19th, our third episode of season 8 comes out. Really, I love the response to the last one, the Ultimate Bleeding Disorders PSA. It is a hilarious episode and some really good stuff in there about advocacy, about women with bleeding disorders and disclosure. And now the episode coming on Tuesday is we touch on aging, a little bit on inhibitors, breakthrough bleeds, pain and pain management. It's a really dynamic episode and very funny with a special guest who does some pretty cool magic. So check that out over at stbhemo.com. I'm going to tell you about the the Powering Through pod and Ask the Expert pod in just a little bit. We also have something very cool going on with the Bloodline podcast series. So that's our deep dive, that kind of 3-episode deep look at a particular topic. We have 2 series so far, one on VWD and one on young men with hemophilia. Our next series, I don't think I can talk about it quite yet, so I can't. So I'm not gonna, but it's been really fun to work on. It's coming along well, and we should be able to share it soon. So stay tuned for the Bloodline podcast series updates, bloodstreammedia.com. Thanks as always, of course, to Shire for making this possible. I was actually just talking to some folks from Shire who are fans of the podcast and talking about how, what goes into it and the process and all the ins and outs. And I really enjoyed geeking out on it, and I appreciated the level of interest and kind of how the chicken gets made. So thank you for that. And thank you to Shire for continuing to support this new media effort of ours. And last thing before we get into our episode here, as I record this, I should mention I'm recording this from Orlando, Florida. Tomorrow, Rob from Believe and I are going to be doing a Stop the Bleeding workshop with about 400 people who are attending the Greater Florida Association's meeting this weekend at SeaWorld. So we are actually now down in Orlando, Florida. Just thought I would mention that for no particular reason. But the last thing I do want to mention for a specific reason is a colleague and friend of mine, Vanessa Herrick, who has worked at the WFH the last number of years, is moving on. She's moving on to the next phase of her professional life, and I will miss her as a colleague and an ally at the WFH. All the trips you hear us talk about, the videos you hear me talk about making for their humanitarian aid program, it all runs through Vanessa. And she has a background in production and documentary filmmaking and story capture. So not only was she an excellent representative of our partner organization, but she truly was like a colleague when it came to the actual executing of the work that we needed to do and the things that we needed to account for. So I will miss working with Vanessa in that capacity. And I also want to make sure that we get someone really strong in that position to replace her as the Director of Marketing and Communications for the World Federation of Hemophilia. So at the time of this recording, again, Friday, June 15th, that position is open. The WFH, through all their social channels, is promoting applicants to submit. If you or a talented somebody you know would be good in the role of Director of Marketing and Communications for the WFH and has an interest in living in Montreal, Canada, I would highly recommend you look into that. Director of Marketing and Communications at the WFH, open as of today. All right, and I think that is it. We'll dive into the episode. I hope you enjoy it. Episode 25 of the BloodStream Podcast. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome to the BloodStream Podcast, episode 25, June 18th, 2018. I am Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm Natalie Lynch.
On this episode, Natalie and I do a mega review of major headlines and data presentations coming out of the World Federation of Hemophilia's 2018 World Congress. Dakota Rosenfelt shares how hemophilia impacted his life and pursuit of pharmacy in a piece he's titled A Prescription for Success, and we'll speak with a clinician about women with bleeding disorders, the takeaways from World Congress, and where the treatment and management of women with bleeding disorders is right now. All that and more coming up on this episode. Welcome to BloodStream. Where do we go from here? How do I my note now says back from Glasgow, so help me transition.
You are back from Scotland.
Yeah.
How was it?
Good. Is that interesting? They heard me talk about that every day in the Daily Recap podcast.
But was everyone who's listening to this listening to that?
Well, I don't know, but you can get a better sense if you had. Scotland was great.
For those who weren't listening,
yeah,
brief recap of your experience.
My experience was it was great. The conference was held in a lovely part of downtown Glasgow, so there was an interesting cultural component to the entire thing. As always, it was attended by a diverse group of clinicians, researchers, patient organization leaders from all around the world, intermingled in this very rare circumstance that only comes up once every 2 years. The sessions were dynamic. There were interesting people online giving takeaways, screenshotting, or taking cell pics of slides, adding some commentary, which was really helpful because there's so many things happening at once. You can't be at everything. And in general, I thought there was some great stuff presented about future treatments, humanitarian aid developments, and an uptick in the recognition of advancements and the need for more advancements for women with bleeding disorders. So that was kind of my experience. That and the inability to adjust to the time zone and the fact that it was bright until 11 o'clock at night kind of round out my experience of Glasgow.
They were full days. They were long days.
They were long days, and then like when you were ready for bed, it was like still bright. And I was like, how is it still going? And then it was bright again at like 5 a.m. It was just very strange. The first few nights having trouble getting used to the time change, and then the light wasn't helping. It was a whole thing. But it was wonderful, and actually since have already been here on the road in the U.S. for kind of like back to the grind in the usual manner. Was in South Carolina recently for a Stop the Bleeding workshop and a keynote presentation, and by the time you hear this, I will also have been to the Hemophilia Foundation of Greater Florida for an event of theirs. I forget what it's titled, to do a big Stop the Bleeding workshop for a few hundred people down there. So that should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and speaking of Stop the Bleeding.
Ooh, good transition, Natalie. You're a pro. Yeah, we just debuted season 8. Well, so by the time we're recording this, we just released the first episode from season 8. By the time this comes out, the first 2 are out. So June 5th, we released our The Devil Bleeds Nada. episode, which is looking at, thank you, at professional development and self-care. Our June 12th episode is a screwball one on advocacy, featuring a character with VWD who we met in season 7. We brought back for this episode. Every Tuesday through Tuesday, August 7th, a new episode of Stop the Bleeding will be coming out. And you can find them on YouTube or Facebook. Just search Stop the Bleeding, or you can go to stbhemo.com. You'll find the episodes embedded there, as well as links to our social channels. But really excited for this season, and I like the way the first 2 episodes are looking.
I enjoyed it. I was laughing out loud.
What was your favorite moment from the first episode?
Oh wow.
Or what was a laugh out loud moment for you?
Well, I don't want to give away any of the stuff. But
this is called a teaser. It's a 12-minute episode. Give them a 30-second moment you liked.
Well, I like how the interns are now kind of taking the lead and mocking, our normal characters.
Yeah, some of our legacy characters, so to speak. That was a very conscious decision to the younger characters, the younger cast members, to put them more in positions of leadership. And our very first episode of the season is primarily driven by 2 of our younger characters, which is the first time we've opened a season putting so much of the narrative weight on the younger characters, younger actors too. So that was very conscientious. Glad you picked up on that.
Yeah, and funny.
So stbhemo.com for that. The latest episode of the Powering Through podcast features Vanessa and Jason Flora, along with Heather Stevenson, childhood best friend of Ryan White. That's from a Powering Through that we did at the Hemophilia of Indiana. And the latest Ask the Expert podcast with host Chris Bombardier features Sherry Lucky, the adoption advocacy and outreach coordinator from the Hemophilia of Michigan, talking about the adoption process, adopting children with chronic medical conditions, and her personal experience adopting a child with hemophilia from a developing country. You can find links to the Ask the Expert podcast, the Powering Through podcast, and all the things that we're doing here at BloodStream Media in the program notes, but also by visiting bloodstreammedia.com.
Hey, do you want to say something about breaking through?
Yeah. So since we last talked to you, we have also launched a brand new program that Ryan, my partner at Believe Limited, and I have been working on for 3 years, called Breaking Through. It is a new musical theater intensive designed to give teens affected by bleeding disorders the opportunity to spend 3 days learning and workshopping an original musical theater piece titled Hemophilia the Musical that they will help create in New York City. And the goal of this program is really to give avenue to the arts as an opportunity for young people to engage in extracurricular activities, social activities, and safe, healthy ways to self-explore, experiment with forms of pain management and distraction, frankly, through the arts. There are so many therapeutic and other benefits to participating in the arts in a meaningful way, but we don't currently as a community have a platform that champions, incentivizes, and otherwise organizes something as grand as Breaking Through. And that is why a few years ago, we decided we thought this is something that should exist. We, as people that come from the arts and many of us from theater, that we should be behind. And we've been talking to clinicians about. We circled the working groups of clinicians at NHF a few years ago to talk to PTs and social workers and nurses and say, do you like this concept? Would you promote this? Do you know patients at your HTC who would want to participate in something like this? And across the board, it was yes, yes, yes. In fact, the only pushback we got was, could you also incorporate set designers, or what about that? I was like, yeah, we could probably, but year one, we've just got to get it right. So the focus on year one is taking 25 teens, again, from around the country affected by bleeding disorders. That's people with hemophilia and von Willebrand disease, as well as siblings. 25 people coming into New York to spend 3 days learning the ins and outs of what it takes to be a performer in music theater, and also how those skills benefit you as an individual. We have partnered with BioMarin on this project, and I am thrilled by the conversations we've had with them, that we had with them speculatively, that we've had with them since the agreement, that we have had through the development process. They've been an awesome partner. It's a really healthy exchange of ideas and information. Had a great call just yesterday, actually recapping our launch properties, because right now, if you go to breakingthroughhemophilia.com, you will see there, actually by the time this comes out, you're going to see everything you need to see. Right now, it's just a holding place to enter information so that we'll email you when the site launches. But by the time Oh, no, I'm wrong. You do have to go to that website and enter your email address. We launch at the beginning of next month. July 1 is when we launch. So if you go to breakingthroughhemophilia.com right now, links in the program notes, there'll be an opportunity for you to enter your email address. And if you want to be amongst the first people to receive information when we open the applicant pool, we have actually already, I know, received, not exaggerating, several dozen requests for information, and this is for a program that will serve in year 1, live anyway, 25 people. So sincerely, if this is something that interests you, if you know somebody with a bleeding disorder, a teenager or a teen sibling who you think would really appreciate an experience like this, I highly recommend go to breakingthroughhemophilia.com, enter your email address, and as soon as we send you launch information, do respond. We're going to be going through all of the submissions very carefully. This is an awesome opportunity, and I appreciate that not everybody can participate. So we're going to take our time in going through the applications. But please, if you know of somebody, give them the best shot possible and nominate them or submit them for this project. How's that? Did I cover with enthusiasm everything you could have imagined?
It's clear you're excited.
Yeah, I am. I mean, it's years.
It's your wheelhouse.
It's my wheelhouse. It's years in the making, and it's something that, when you're working on something for years, and frankly, this is a little like highfalutin of me, but when you hear about scientists in laboratories, some of whom have worked on medications for people with hemophilia, who are chipping away and chipping away and chipping away, and they're just not getting the results they need, and then in the 11th hour, as they're about to scrap the years and tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of research and just say, never mind, there's a light bulb moment, there's an aha. This isn't that, but when you've been working on something for years and years and years, and you acknowledge the inherent challenges in bringing it to fruition, and then it finally finds the right partner and the right way forward, it's extraordinarily gratifying. So yeah, I'm excited. Breakingthroughhemophilia.com. If you have questions, you can email Bloodstream, mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. There's also an email address on that website, but you're free to email mailbag as well if you have any questions. And yeah, you'll be hearing more about Breaking Through Hemophilia on the Bloodstream podcast as well going forward. So you heard us just talk about Stop the Bleeding Season 8 launching on June 5th. It is our 8th season of Stop the Bleeding, which is a program that we would not be able to do without the continued support from Shire, who has been an incredible supporter of a very novel way to engage young people using content and entertainment. So thank you to Shire for all the support of Stop the Bleeding. And thank you to Shire for all the support of this novel way of communicating important information to our community in a timely and comprehensive manner. So thank you to Shire for the support of Stop the Bleeding. And as always, for being the supporter of the Bloodstream podcast, Natalie and I like to say, thank you, Shire. All right, so for this month, we are doing away with the traditional like and comment segments that Natalie and I typically lead, respectively. And instead, we're doing one big mega review of WFH takeaways, study updates that have come out recently, and more other interesting news that's pertinent to the community. So it's kind of just this big community news segment, essentially, that we're going to use the real estate from the like segment and the comment segments to afford today. A couple notes, though, before we jump into our various paragraphs here. The WFH, they did a 2016 recap of their Congress, which is still live on the WFH's Congress website. There is not yet, at the time of this recording anyway, a 2018 World Congress recap. So if you're curious to know more about World Congress, if anything that we say, if you want to go to the World Congress, to the WFH for their recap of a particular session, you can find the World Congress Daily Recap papers. Those were the morning papers made available every day during Congress, and the digital versions were online. They are all still online. You can follow links to the program notes or just look up WFH Congress Daily 2018, and you'll find those there. What we are about to go through are stories from PR from manufacturers, news briefings from patient organizations, articles written by authors in the financial part of the pharmaceutical world. So there's different voices that have contributed to this segment. And that's the reason I mention that is because at the end of the day, I just urge you to do your own due diligence. If anything that we say strikes you or is relevant to you or your family, please follow the links in the program notes and read these articles on your own, read additional material on the subject, Google search for more information. I hope that this serves as an introduction to some information, gives you a few pieces of specifics to grab onto, but I do want to make sure everyone hearing this, I'm not a doctor. I don't know if anybody knew that. I'm not a doctor.
He's always repeating that.
It's important. I'm trying to make sure you get information, but I don't want to misrepresent who I am in delivering that information. And you need to be empowered by making sure you have the information you need, not that you just heard Patrick well and Natalie. So with all that being said, let's skip over this little piece right here, Natalie, and let's just jump into the very first bit, which is sort of in the WFH takeaways, study updates, and more. Our very first piece really fits into the and more category.
And here I go with more. FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb says he's determined to clear the pathway for drug developers in a move to accelerate the first wave of gene therapies. The first therapeutic area to benefit will be hemophilia.
Hey, thank Gottlieb.
Gottlieb says, quote, FDA has more than 500 active investigational new drug applications involving gene therapy products. We've received more than 100 such applications last year alone. This shows the intensity of the scientific work going on in this field.
It sounds like it's kind of the FDA recognizing there's a need to his point, clear a pathway to allow this proliferation to continue.
Yeah, and prioritize it.
Yeah.
It's great.
So along those lines, BioMarin presented data during WFH on their investigational gene therapy, formerly known as BMN 270, currently known by something I dare not even attempt to pronounce at this point. But the bottom line is that the data presented included a 104-week data set from a high-dose cohort of this study and a 52-week data set from a low-dose cohort of this study. Patients in the high-dose cohort showed a 97% reduction in annual bleed rate, or ABR, no spontaneous bleeds, and an elimination of all bleeds in target joints during the second year. Across all 104 weeks for both sets of patients, across all 104 weeks for the high-dose cohort set, so across all 2 years, but for the high-dose set, an average of 78.5% of patients had zero bleeds requiring factor VIII infusions compared to a pre-study baseline of 14%. So that's a big difference. And patients in the 52-week low-dose cohort did show similar results.
Bayer presented preliminary insights from the U.S. segment of the Global HemActive Patients Survey. These initial survey results showed that among adults, U.S. adults living with hemophilia, 9 out of 10 aspire to be active or very active, including participating in outdoor activities. 2 out of 3 are not able to participate in the activities they would like to. 3 out of 4 make adjustments to their activities because of the condition due to fear of bleeds, pain, and joint damage. 1 out of 2 adjust their treatment, such as infuse more often, to allow them to be more active. Final results of this study, which will include the responses from patients in the US, France, Italy, and Germany, as well as responses from parents of pediatric patients, is expected in August 2018.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see those full results. From Novo Nordisk, a new head-to-head pharmacokinetic study showed that adults with hemophilia B who received a single dose of ribinin, that's a coagulation factor IX recombinant therapy with the glycopegylated mechanism, achieved an average half-life of 103.2 hours compared to those treated with the recombinant factor IX Fc fusion protein mechanism, who on average achieved 84.9 hours half-life. So for those interested in the extended half-life, and this is particular to hemophilia B, the pegylated versus Fc fusion protein differences and nuances, at least in this particular study, Novo reports 103 hours half-life for those with the for those with the pegylated, 84.9, 85 hours for those on the Fc fusion product.
Patient advocacy groups in 5 states will focus on the challenges affecting patients with blood disorders with grant support from the Local Empowerment for Advocacy Development, or LEAD program.
Well done.
Sponsored by CSL Behring.
Who are the 5 groups, Natalie?
The 5 groups are the Bleeding Disorders Foundation of Washington, the Bleeding Disorders Alliance of Illinois, the Gateway Hemophilia Foundation in Missouri, Hemophilia of South Carolina, and the Hemophilia Foundation of Michigan.
Oh, we was there too recently.
You can read about the advocacy initiatives of each organization in the article hyperlinked in the program notes.
Nicely done. 2 pieces related to Octapharma. Octapharma, there was a presentation of preclinical data from SubQ8, an investigational recombinant factor 8 from a human cell line for subcutaneous administration. SubQ8 also utilizes von Willebrand factor in an innovative approach to facilitate introducing factor 8 into circulation. It's preclinical data, so we're not into clinical trials yet, but interestingly enough, in animal models, there was a 3.6-fold prolongation of factor 8 half-life compared to that of factor 8 intravenous infusion. So the potential for something as significant as a 3.6x half-life is not to be overlooked. And another piece from Octapharma, there was data from a study looking at optimized treatment plans of Nuvic, a 4th-generation human cell line-derived recombinant factor 8 therapy. The individualized dosing enabled 57% of patients to reduce dosing to twice weekly or less, whilst maintaining effective bleed protection. 83% of patients were spontaneous bleed free.
Hey.
Not bad.
Data from uniQure suggests that uniQure's AAV5 gene therapy may be a viable treatment for 97% of patients.
And full disclosure, there's additional data that was given to support that claim. However, frankly, I struggled to interpret it and understand it well enough to bring to you in any kind of meaningful way. So again, check out the program notes if you want to read more about uniQure and the great stuff that they're doing in the gene therapy world for patients with hemophilia. And from Bioverativ, a Sanofi company, they've announced preliminary phase 1/2a safety and pharmacokinetic clinical data for BIVV001, a novel and investigational factor A therapy for people with hemophilia A that incorporates a partner's technology to improve half-life. And that's the interesting piece of this. So Bioverativ has noted that this therapy is the only investigational factor 8 therapy that has been specifically designed to overcome the von Willebrand factor ceiling, which is believed to impose a half-life limitation on current factor 8 therapies. Very interesting. Data from the study showed that a single low dose of BIVV001 extended the half-life of factor 8 to an unprecedented 37 hours with high factor activity levels and was generally well tolerated.
Congratulations to NHF Senior Vice President Dawn Rodolini for her election onto the board of directors of the World Federation of Hemophilia. In response to her election, Dawn said, "I am thrilled at this opportunity to help advance WFH's vision of treatment for all. The fact is that 75% of people with bleeding disorders around the world still receive very inadequate treatment or no treatment at all. But I'm confident that if we work together, one day all people with bleeding disorders will have proper care and treatment, no matter where they live."
From Shire, Shire presented clinical data evaluating the capacity of recombinant von Willebrand factor to replenish functional von Willebrand factor and restore factor 8 levels when administered before, during, and or after surgery for adult patients affected by von Willebrand disease. The results show the potential for recombinant von Willebrand factor to help manage bleeding risks during and post-surgery. Recombinant von Willebrand factor from Shire is marketed in the US anyway as Von Vendi.
From Novo Nordisk, a new long-term stability study has shown that hemophilia A treatment Novo 8 remains potent after 3 months of exposure to temperatures of 104 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which,
that's hot.
Yeah, that's really hot. And for people for whom refrigeration of product or storage temperatures in general are a thing, like that's not insignificant. Because at first I was like, is that significant? Like for me, not necessarily, but for some people, that's definitely significant.
Yeah, and for 3 months too. That's a long time at hot temperatures.
From Roche Genentech, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, maybe you heard of them, has granted priority review for Hemlibra for adults and children with hemophilia A without factor 8 inhibitors. In November, they were approved for the treatment of with factor VIII inhibitors, now without, is being reviewed. This is based on data from the phase 3 Haven 3 study, and the FDA is expected to make a decision on approval by October 4th, 2018.
So Patrick, maybe you can give us a little more insight on this. Core Heme publishes a core outcome set for hemophilia clinical trials, prepares to launch next phase of work. What does that mean?
Yeah, so essentially this is an initiative it's a multi-stakeholder initiative. So it's the NHF and the various companies who are working in the gene therapy space coming together to put a set of guidelines that recommend a specific minimum set of outcomes to include in hemophilia gene therapy clinical trials. Since there's so much unknown here, it's important that all these organizations are working together to determine what do we need these studies to be articulating and how are we going to assess success and outcomes. And Core Heme is the beginning of standardizing the data sets that we want to be taking a look at. So, nothing like activating for patients, but just good to know that behind the scenes, those who are evaluating all this stuff on the highest levels are acknowledging the need for standardization. From Spark and Pfizer, Spark presented data on hemophilia B patients who received a version of its gene therapy manufactured using a modified process. So early data on the patients suggests that the new batch of therapies is at least as effective as its predecessor. For background, Spark switched to a new vector. So whenever we hear AAV associated with gene therapy, that V stands for vector. Spark switched to a new vector manufacturing process last year, and the mid-development switch created a risk that the gene therapy Spark and their partner Pfizer moved into phase 3 would be less effective than the one shown in phase 1 and 2, because that's where the switch took place between 1 and 2 and 3. However, data from phase 1 and 2 showed patients produce factor IX levels ranging from 14% to 77%, while data from phase 3 utilizing this new process resulted in levels ranging from 38% to 55%. So kind of interesting. It's within, 14 to 77 is quite a range. And then obviously 38 to 55 is within that range, lower ceiling or lower floor, but lower ceiling, higher floor. You know what I'm trying to go for. What Natalie said is better, tighter range. Worth noting that the phase 3 data here is based solely on 3 patients.
And finally, we have data from a study on aging, von Willebrand's factor levels, and bleeding risk. Investigators recently looked at the effect of aging on von Willebrand's factor levels in patients with type 1 von Willebrand's disease. The review included 39 patients, 32 female, 7 male. The mean age of participants was 41.8 years, and 34% of female patients were taking hormonal therapy. After data analysis, it was determined that aging was associated with a decrease in bleeding symptoms with type 1 von Willebrand disease patients. They did not, however, establish a link between aging and increased VWF levels, and the authors of the corresponding article recognized that this conclusion runs up against previous studies suggesting that despite increasing VWF levels, bleeding symptoms do not decrease in aging type 1 VWD patients, and referred to the need for additional studies as sorely needed.
Yeah, so it sounds like their study is suggesting there's at least a correlation between aging, higher von Willebrand factor levels, and reduced bleeding symptoms. However, that runs contrary to studies that say, no, there aren't reduced bleeding symptoms, and the result being we just need to understand this better. All right, so that does it. That's our mega recap of stuff. I hope that was interesting. We tried to, again, look at all the stuff that's come out in the last month and present it in some manageable way. If you'd like more information about anything that was presented, again, refer to the program notes in your podcast player or on the episode 25 page of the BloodStreamPod.com website. Reminder as well, the World Federation of Hemophilia's website includes their World Congress daily recap papers. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, corrections, or if you just need to say hi, you can email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. This month's Share segment comes to us from the United States, from a young adult with hemophilia named Dakota Rosenfelt. In a piece he's titled A Prescription for Success, Dakota, who is studying pharmacy professionally, outlines how hemophilia has impacted his life both positively and negatively. Here's Dakota.
A prescription for success. Hemophilia, as anyone affected by it can tell you, tends to become a very large part of our lives. Whether it was making what came to be lifelong friends at Bleeding Disorders Camp or attending big community events, a lot of my earliest memories revolve around the Bleeding Disorders community. These experiences became my guiding light and really led me to what I want to do in life. In short, of course, I want to give back to my community. This has manifested in various ways over the years, including working as a camp counselor or volunteering at various bleeding disorders events. But most recently, I created HemoTool, an unbranded logging app to help those of us living with bleeding disorders manage our care. My journey with HemoTool has really shown me the importance of a consistent, well-educated medical team, and it's led me to my true calling, a career in pharmacy. I'm currently in pharmacy school at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where I'm slated to graduate in May of 2019 with my doctorates of pharmacy. I'm finishing up my last year of work in the classroom, and I'm eager to begin rotations in various healthcare settings around the KC area, of which will include outpatient care clinics, community pharmacies, and even a hospital emergency room. It's important to note, though, my approach to pharmacy is a bit different than the traditional community pharmacist approach. I'm interested in becoming a medical science liaison, or an MSL for short. The role of the MSL is rather unique because we basically learn everything about a specific therapy or drug class, and then we go out to educate healthcare professionals and patients about the good, the bad, and the ugly of a specific drug. Due to the impact hemophilia has had on my life and the lives of others I know, I feel my efforts to educate patients and healthcare professionals would be best directed down this path. I've always been a person who consumes vast amounts of information. In fact, I love reading. I can clear a book in a day if you give me some free time. But more importantly, as it relates to my future career, I enjoy relaying information in ways others can understand. This love of information in concert with my passion for the hemophilia community is a constant reminder I'm following my heart. I'm a firm believer in the saying, if you enjoy what you do, you will never work a day in your life. Hemophilia has given me and my family a lot of ups and downs throughout the years, but at the age of 22, I'm fortunate enough to be a highly active individual, all due to my care team. Yeah, of course, there's caveats to my healthy lifestyle, including arthritis in my left ankle, which tends to limit my mobility from time to time. But I view this more as an opportunity to share firsthand experiences in an educational and sympathetic way. Hemophilia can seem like a limitation, I get it. But like so many things, this condition is what you make of it. I encourage every person who may be hearing this, if you're having a hard time due to your bleeding disorder, please reach out to someone in the community, attend a regional or national event, do something to get involved, and do not hesitate to ask questions. For all you know, there's at least one other person who may be having or who has had the same difficulties you're facing.
Thank you very much, Dakota, for sharing that piece. You know, Dakota's not alone in being a patient with a bleeding disorder who, having spent so much time in clinics growing up, is then inclined and curious and moves on to professionally pursue a clinical or pharmaceutical position in one way or another. HTCs has a profound impact on patients and their families, and I do want to make you aware of htcsurvey.com. So this is something that I saw the Hemophilia Federation of America, HFA, promoting, and I'm going to read what they've written about it here. Let your voice be heard on the second National Patient Satisfaction Survey of Hemophilia Treatment Centers. HTCs across the country want to know how satisfied you are with your care. If you or someone you care for had contact with your HTC in 2017, click on the link provided in the program notes, and you can respond in either English or Spanish and share your experience. You're encouraged to complete the survey online if possible. It should only take a few minutes, one survey per family, and you can take the survey through June 30th. We know our HTCs are under some threat to lose funding from a variety of sources. So if there was ever a time to participate in a survey about your satisfaction for your HTC, especially if you are satisfied, often when we are satisfied, we just don't respond to these things. It's a good time to respond. So htcsurvey.com, take a look at that and respond if you've been to an HTC or if you were an HTC in 2017. Also, I want to take this moment to once again thank the sponsor, supporter, champion, what's another word? I'm out of words, but Shire, for all of their support of the BloodStream podcast. We appreciate you enabling us to provide community with this new media way of communicating information and updates relative to our community. So as always, we like to say, Thank you, Shire. Okay, so joining me now here on the BloodStream Podcast, up from Ontario, Canada, is Lisa Thibeault. She is the Hemophilia Nurse Coordinator at the Southeastern Ontario Regional Inherited Bleeding Disorders Program, part of the Kingston Health Services Centre in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Lisa and I bumped into each other at one of the sessions during WFH's World Congress. This episode is intended to give as many takeaways and insights from the Congress as possible. And one of the few topics that I was really interested in seeing how the Congress was going to account for this year was that of women with bleeding disorders. But rather than kind of do too much preambling here, Lisa, let me ask you, as an expert in that space, let me rewind the tape just a little bit. How did you first get involved in bleeding disorders in general? And then at what point in that journey did you realize that women with bleeding disorders had some particularly unmet needs that we had to address?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been a bleeding disorders nurse for about 8 years now, nurse for about 18 years total. And I think the fact that I actually fell into this job, there was a nurse in Kingston here who had cancer. So I was asked to cover her role and while she was away. So when I started that, I was probably about a month in, and I was like, this is a pretty special job. Like, not too many people know this job, know about this role, know about these patients. And it, like I said, it probably only took about a month for me to kind of fall in love with the job and fall in love with the role and like be dedicated to my patients almost instantly, actually. So when she came back, they actually asked me to stay on. And so 8 years later, here I am. But over those 8 years, definitely I have hemophilia patients and I have von Willebrand's patients, but I find at our center, we have a big drive for women with bleeding disorders. So I work with Dr. Paula James, and our focus has kind of been going down that road over, I would say, probably the last 5 years. That has been our focus, both in practice and awareness, and our conference attendance and stuff. That's what we're trying to improve for everybody across Canada and the world.
And in those last 5 years in particular, what have been some of the key moments or the key turning points or advancements that you have seen?
So I would say the two that stand out the most are us establishing the Let's Talk Period website. So it's letstalkperiod.ca, and Dr. James has, we've all kind of worked on getting information onto that website, but Dr. James has worked at getting the SELF-SPAT, the self-bleeding assessment tool, on there. And what that is a series of questions that an individual can go online and answer. And it just talks about, challenges through life related to bleeding. And at the end of that test, it gives you a score. And if it's over 4, the recommendation is to kind of print that sheet out, bring it to your family doctor, and say, hey, I think I need a bit more testing here. Can we maybe get me to a hematologist, or can you do some initial special coagulation testing and stuff? So that has been the biggest one, and that's been about 4 years, I think, for that. The Code Rouge was the other big one. So Code Rouge was a conference we just held in Quebec City right after a WFH, actually. So it was about 2 weeks ago. That conference was huge. It was just a one-day conference, but it could have been like a week conference. There was so much richness in the program, and excuse me, the people that we had come down. We had Dr. Andrew James come. We had Dr. Sidonio come down from the States. World experts coming to speak about women with bleeding disorders and raising awareness and what's missing in centers and what we need to establish these clinics. And I felt like those were the two biggest turning points in kind of our world and the world of women with bleeding disorders for sure.
So one follow-up along those lines, if casting the net a bit wider, knowing that the vast majority of women that have bleeding disorders, and men for that matter, are undiagnosed, having the Let's Talk Period website available and the self-assessment tool to help ultimately lead to more identification and diagnosis, that's important. And raising more awareness, we know that's important. From a clinical standpoint and in the actual management then of these either newly identified patients or in an environment with increased awareness, and however that may make your job that much easier, it's not easier, but simpler in some way. Can you just translate that into the clinical practice and how that articulates into better treatment of your patients?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing with the women with bleeding disorders and men with von Willebrand's disease and bleeding disorders as well is iron deficiency. And there's a study right now that we're starting at St. Mike's in Toronto, really focusing on iron deficiency in the pregnant woman and getting her optimized before she delivers, because we see postpartum depression and quality of life postpartum is decreased in this population. So we really want to focus on that group of women and get them optimized with their iron before they go in and have a baby and drop their iron again. And then it's maybe not picked up for, a couple of months. And then they're struggling with a newborn plus, the iron deficiency. And that's not a good combination. I think Dr. James here in Kingston has said, we have about 400 patients, but for a city this size, we have about 130,000 people in our city. We should actually have 1,200 patients. So we're missing a huge group of people within our own community, and we have one of the world leaders in our community. So what does that say? When we're really focused on this, we can do better. I've really realized over these last two conferences that I've attended that I need to do something with the general practitioners in the community. Dr. James and her lab have done, her PhD student about 8 years ago, surveyed the general practitioners in Kingston and did some awareness. But I want to look at that again, and I want to kind of do something. I don't know what that project's going to look like, but I want to do something with them because that's where it starts, right? So they can't get to us if the family doctors don't have the awareness and education around bleeding disorders.
And I should mention, because I didn't in the beginning, you just referred to having one of the world experts. We've mentioned Dr. Paula James, the doctor at your treatment center, her name a few times, but just to underscore it, she is one of probably the handful of top leading hematologists focused on women with bleeding disorders. Is that a fair characterization, would you say, Lisa? Absolutely. Yes, she is. I'm lucky to work for her. So just so that we have a little bit of context as to who Lisa's referring to, and the person that's leading the team that she's a part of. So speaking about the meeting then, and speaking about Congress, you just gave us a little bit of insight, but were there any other takeaways or coming out of there, any other action items that you had accrued? And then likewise, is there anything about the meeting, we'll get into kind of my point of view toward the end of this, but I was, as I mentioned earlier, curious to see how a few different topics we're going to articulate through the sessions and in conversation, and one of them being women with bleeding disorders. It seemed as though there were a fair number of sessions and a decent amount of, I'll say, promotion about those sessions and this topic. But I also acknowledge that I'm not a woman with a bleeding disorder, and I may have a very different POV on that. So, and neither are you, from what I know. But as a treater in that space, I'm sure you were much more sensitive to this topic than necessarily I was. So, what were your takeaways, and what could we maybe be doing even better as we go forward and look at the 2020 meeting?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely more programming at World Federation this time around. I think we could do better for sure. I think there could be a whole day spent on women with bleeding disorders, a whole track. So I think my biggest takeaway from that meeting was actually one patient who had a factor 1 deficiency, who explained her whole story and her whole life of just crazy bleeding and terrible trips to emerge and some mistreatment by healthcare practitioners along her road and her journey. And I was very affected by that because she made a comment about a nurse had called her like a nightmare patient. And it has stuck with me ever since the Congress, because I cannot imagine someone calling a patient who's gone through as much as she has a nightmare patient. speaking with Dr. Paula James after the Congress, we've decided a couple of things. Like we currently give our women with bleeding disorders who are having babies, we give them like a sheet, a treatment record, let's say. So a record of their last visit, their weight, their treatment protocol, and they have that in their baby bag going into the hospital, so that when someone says, "Hey, I'm going to give you factor," when actually they only need, say, desmopressin or tranexamic acid, they pull out that note and say, "No, listen, like this is what Dr. James and Lisa have said. So do this or call them, please." So I think we've definitely done that with our obstetrical patients, but after hearing this woman speak, we're going to now do it with our surgical patients too. So that was the biggest thing that impacted me. I know there was tons of things at World Congress, gene therapy and all the other, and I work with one of the other world leaders about gene therapy, Dr. David Lillicrap. But my takeaway as a person, as a healthcare provider, dealing with women with bleeding disorders would be that one patient story, to be honest with you.
Well, and I think that actually is a tremendously important point to underscore, because we know you hear as a patient, we hear how important it is to tell your story. If you share your story either with certain clinicians or certain manufacturers or people behind the scenes, the impact it can have, because they either don't get enough patient time or they never hear patients speak that candidly, whatever the case may be. So I think it's such a testament to that point, the value of the story, that at the maybe arguably the leading World Congress that takes place every 2 years for our community, with all of the experts and gene therapy and everything else, what's the thing you walked away being most impacted by was a patient story. I think that says a lot, about that refrain we constantly hear, the importance of telling your story. Well, that's exactly why it's important. You took action based on that story thereafter, and it's influenced your thinking. So it's good for someone like me to hear that, who once in a while can get fatigued by the idea of tell your story. It's like, again, does it matter? Is it doing anything? That your sharing is evidence that it does matter.
Those are the stories that we want to hear. We learn from all of the time. We definitely want the scientists and everybody else to be doing the work as well, but we will change our practice based on what you guys tell us. And that's how it's individualized care, no matter what bleeding disorder we're talking about. Just because it's presented one way at a World Congress is not how we're actually going to take it back to practice, unless it's individualized, unless that patient tells us that that's what they want and that's how they want their care to go. So I think patient stories always impact us. And that's how I lead my practice. So
I am curious to know a little bit more about the system of treatment and the clinical practice in Canada. It's its own interview, it's its own podcast. It's, I'm sure, a very big topic. But I wonder if you would be able to give us, knowing that most of the listeners to this are American-based, not all, but most. So just share with us a little bit about how your model works, and I can try to point out any similarities or differences that I think are interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So I surveyed the inherited bleeding disorders comprehensive care centers across Canada before Code Rouge. I had sent a survey that had 9 questions. I had about a 65% response rate, and I asked questions about. This is in collaboration with the Canadian Hemophilia Society. I didn't just make this up on my own. So we asked questions. Describe your healthcare delivery model for women and girls with bleeding disorders in your center. What disciplines make up your comprehensive care team? Do you have the proper coagulation lab in the hospital to perform all necessary tests? How many women and girls attend the clinic annually? Do you feel that the care of women with bleeding disorders is an established priority at your center? Do you think that women with bleeding disorders are adequately managed? What are the barriers encountered? So I think if we go back, it seems that most of our centers across Canada do see women and girls in a regular women and bleeding disorders clinic annually with a comprehensive care team, and that does include an OBGYN. The varying weeks, like ours in Kingston, we run it every 4 weeks, but some people only run it twice a year, and some people run it quarterly. So that's the difference. But we had a kind of 30% response rate to that. And then Model C was an OBGYN or anesthetist is part of the comprehensive care team, but only during pregnancy. And then the biggest model was that women and girls with bleeding disorders are referred to OBGYNs if they're around times of delivery and stuff, and if they have to have surgeries related to their heavy periods and stuff. So that's the area that I noticed that needs the most improvement. So I think that was also one of the biggest barriers, was not having a dedicated OBGYN to the women and bleeding disorders clinic. Disciplines that are across the comprehensive care team, we had a 100% response rate, obviously, for hematologist and nurse, but about a 50% response rate for the physiotherapist, the social worker, the psychologist, anesthetist, and pharmacist. The anesthetist and pharmacist were only about a 5%. So I think there was only one clinic in Canada, I think it was Toronto, that had that discipline accessible at the clinics. And then special coags, this one surprised me. So the question was, the coagulation team in the hospital are able to perform all necessary tests for women with bleeding disorders. We had 80% yes response rate for that, and a 20% no. So that's actually reassuring. I like to see that. So, and I guess the last thing would just be the barriers. So some of the responses were, as I said, so no dedicated OBGYN, patients living in remote rural areas. Someone wrote resources. Not all members of the healthcare team are present for all clinics, and struggle with new consults. So that we can't get the girls in quick enough. I mean, our clinic in Kingston definitely has hematology, OB, myself, and a ton of learners, because we're a teaching hospital, and we run it once a month, and we see anywhere from 10 to 15 patients in that clinic. And that's my model in Kingston. So I'm seeing that there's a lot of work that needs to be done across Canada, but we're bringing awareness to the Canadian population anyways, to kind of say, like, we've got a pretty established clinic here in Kingston. Like, if you guys need some help, like, come visit us. I'll come to you, and Canadian Hemophilia Society is definitely supporting that. And so are the clinic directors across Canada. But I'm already talking with Winnipeg about they are probably going to come down and see my clinic and see how I run it, and then get the tools from me to build their clinic. So we take care of each other, and we want to make sure that goes out into the community and takes care of all the women and girls with bleeding disorders.
The piece you mentioned about the incorporation of the OB, you actually may know this better than I, if it's happening at centers, like, for example, is that something that Dr. Sidonio has incorporated into the practice in Atlanta? That's not something I'm aware of being common around the U.S. In any way. So that's interesting to hear, because that's perhaps one position within the comprehensive team that we talk about a bit, is that psychologist or mental health expert clinician, actually, in response to the growing mental health needs or the growing conversation around mental health needs. I've heard a lot of conversation about do we need to consider incorporating a psychologist or a psychotherapist or someone into the comprehensive care model. I have not heard that with OBs, so that's a takeaway for me. That's an interesting point. It makes perfect sense that you would. And I actually want to use this as an opportunity to kind of transition into our final topic before I have to let you go, because you're actually off and doing this on your own free time. As a fella who has hemophilia, my wife, who co-hosts this podcast with me, is a doula and is very involved with women's health, and I'm appreciating more all the time what it means to be supportive and an ally of her work and an ally of my friends who are women with bleeding disorders. I can't speak for them, but I can amplify voices, and I can try to move spotlights I see in that direction. From your perspective, what more could either partners, spouses, family members of women with bleeding disorders, or we'll say the hemophilia male allies, what more could we all be doing to just generally help the cause?
Talk about it. Ask them about it. Ask them what they're struggling with. Ask them what you can do to help them raise awareness. We've got, maybe hosting, I was thinking about doing like a women's walk, but, with partners, with spouses, with children, and just raising awareness. That's the biggest thing, is just getting them supported so that they don't feel like they are alone and that they're not struggling. So if they are having a really low day because their periods are just out of control and they've been bleeding for 10 days and they just want to lay in bed, supporting them with that and not just thinking that they're, making up excuses, and getting them to the right physicians to deal with that heavy period and deal with iron deficiency, and just really getting the word out at what you're doing and what you've been doing. I've seen your work, so you're doing a great job actually with getting the word out about women with bleeding disorders. I've seen a few clips on Facebook and Instagram, so good work. And just keep doing that. Keep doing that. That is amazing. That's how we're going to reach everybody, is across social media, right? So our Let's Talk Period website, the presentation I'm doing with the grade 9 girls, that was my abstract that I brought to World Federation. And so I'm just one nurse in one community, as I said, of about 130,000 people, but I'm trying to hit every high school in this city to raise awareness. And two of the biggest take-homes I get from those talks are, you have to do this presentation for the boys. That's actually the biggest one. Let's stick with that one. So you have to do this presentation for the boys. And these aren't girls with bleeding disorders that we know of, right? They're just girls who are struggling with periods. So it's getting them all talking, and then getting the male community being comfortable, because they just say, you're cranky, or why can't you do gym, or why,
right.
Why do you have a nosebleed again? Like, what's going on? Like, so it's just getting that knowledge and awareness out to the people who aren't affected, whether it's male or female. But that's my biggest one. So I got to aim at the boys next after with this presentation. But
it's so interesting that you mentioned that about the boys, and that's the number one piece of feedback you get, because I remember, I do, and and we're wrapping up, so I don't want to take too long on a tangent, but I think this is a very important point. I do a lot of workshops with teens in the United States, and I have heard from executive directors before, when talking about their teen track, executive directors at patient organizations, when talking about their teen track or teen programming, during that time, the adults are going to be in insurance session, and, that's boring. So, we want to do this other thing with the teens. But I have heard on multiple occasions from multiple groups from different parts all over this big country, from teen groups, we want to hear more about the insurance stuff. And I think, and only when it's been brought up in the room, and when we've referred to it as a piece of an episode of Stop the Bleeding, and I'm trying to ask them about other components of the episode, and they say, but what about that thing? It's like, yeah, well, that's, insurance, and it's stuff that you guys, I know, aren't really handling too much yet, but will be coming down the pike for you all. But they want to learn about it. And I've been in ad boards, the same thing, with teens who say, I want more information about the way all this works. And what you've just said about hearing you have to do this for the boys, I bet you if you would put a survey out to teens who are sitting at home or sitting wherever, and what are the topics you want to hear about, they wouldn't necessarily identify insurance, but if given the opportunity to engage with that part of the process in a meaningful, interesting, programmatic way, evidently it's something that they're really curious about. Surveys are important, but I think there's a response bias we don't take into account often enough, because there's really great information people don't realize that they want more of until they're exposed to some of it. So they can never ask for it ahead of time. So I hear the parallel in what you just shared, and I think it's important to capture when we notice those kinds of things, even if they're not supported by what returns on a survey or supported by some type of proactive study of some kind. There are other things that need to get addressed that we just aren't capturing. We don't have a tool to capture. Oh, the boys want more on women with bleeding disorders. Oh, the teens want more on insurance. There's just certain tools that I don't think we have and aren't always aware that we don't have. And thank you again for reserving some of your time to come on here and talk about all this and the work that you are doing. And as I mentioned earlier, you are actually off, so I want to let you be off and enjoy that time off. But thank you so much, Lisa, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful. Thank you for having me for sure. And I am off to Northern Ontario, so I will start the car and drive 8 hours up north.
Feel free to reach out anytime. If there are things you're doing that you're trying to spread more awareness out about or anything like that, if you see something you think I should know about, don't hesitate to ping me.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Home stretch now as we move into parting shots and the wrap up for episode 25. But of course, as always, we want to one last time just say thank you to Shire for supporting the BloodStream podcast and our efforts here. As always, we like to say thank you, Shire. Natalie, I need a parting shot for June episode 25. What is your parting shot? One last thing, bleeding disorders related or otherwise, that you'd like to leave our audience with before signing off.
Well, I mean, you're going to kill me, but I want to talk about the piece that you wrote a month ago.
Oh, that was going to be what I was going to bring up. All right, go ahead.
So a month ago, you wrote a piece on your own experience with depression, saying that you didn't want to talk about it, but I'm your wife, so I'm going to push you a little. So that is available on your website and on Facebook, but it's a very important, honest, and brave piece.
Thanks.
What do you have to say about it?
I said what I have to say about it. I wrote it. And I wrote it so that I don't have to say anything about it. I guess what I will say is it was helpful to write. I think for me, it's helpful to write. And, we were talking about breaking through earlier in the podcast and the importance of the arts. And the arts for me has helped me emotionally process. And part of my emotional processing is writing and articulating, either talking out loud to someone or writing down things like I outwardly process. Express. So that was really helpful. And I wasn't sure when I was writing it, if I was just writing it to think, if I was just journaling. I kind of had an idea that I wasn't, but I was like, oh, you're not committed to sharing this. Just write it and then whatever you want to do. But I frankly was getting a little tired of hearing leaders in the community talking about when are we going to do more to elevate the conversation around mental health? We need to do more. This person just suffered from this thing and this problem just happened to this person. And I felt like I don't know what the heck we're supposed to do, but I do agree with, I referenced Kevin Love, the Cleveland Cavalier NBA basketball player. He wrote a piece earlier this year called Everyone's Going Through Something. I think everybody's going through something. And he talked about the need to create a more comfortable environment for the conversation so that we can reduce stigma and actually talk to each other about this. And I guess to me, that kind of feels like what the work is. I don't think we don't need a program necessarily. We don't need a medication. We need to just
have a conversation,
talk more and talk to each other about what we're going through, what helps, what doesn't, what do you do when you're in crisis mode?
What does crisis mode look like?
What does crisis mode look like? Yeah. How do you thrive? What does thriving look like when you're struggling to function sometimes?
Yeah, and that struggle looks different to different people, which I think is important because we all look at everyone else and being like, oh man, they have it together. Wow.
It's interesting. Both they have it together and it could always be worse. Both of those comparison ways of thinking about oneself to me feel really flawed because we're all so different. We go to El Salvador and you can see, well, actually, let's go to Mumbai, right? When we were in Mumbai and in India, we were looking at poverty at a level that in America, you just don't even see. And there, it's not, that's just life. Does that mean my complaints about money in the United States are invalid? No, because it's not really comparable. It's a different experience. Both things are true.
Yeah, both things can be true. And both experiences are valid. So my parting shot is check out that piece, and I'm really proud of my husband and co-producer on this podcast.
All right. Well, as I mentioned, that was my parting shot as well. So we'll just call that a joint parting shot, and I will tell you all that is all for this episode. Thank you to everyone at Believe Limited, the National Hemophilia Foundation, Entertainment to Effect Change, the Hemophilia Alliance, and our sponsor, Shire. Thanks as well to Dakota Rosenfelt for sharing his A Prescription for Success piece. Subscribe to the BloodStream Podcast, the Ask the Expert Podcast, the Powering Through Podcast, and the Bloodline Special Series of podcasts on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream on Facebook.com/BloodstreamMedia and on Twitter @BloodstreamInfo. Reminder to check out the program notes for this episode in your podcast player or on BloodstreamPod.com for links and additional information about the various stories featured on this episode. My name remains Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm Natalie Lynch.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself. Oh, you almost said it with me, but you didn't.
I got shy.
Bye, everybody.